Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome back to Chapter 13. In the last video, we had just finished up talking about the animals that Darwin looked at, or that Darwin saw when he went to the Galapagos. That was the marine iguana and the giant tortoises. This is a picture of the marine iguana. It's kind of an interesting critter, about yay big. It's the only ocean-going lizard in the world. The ocean iguana, it drinks seawater, which is odd for your average reptile. Most reptiles have to drink fresh water. What these guys do is they will swim down, they'll jump into the surf, and they'll swim down 30 or 40 feet to the rocks below, and they'll eat algae off of those rocks. And then, when it gets too cold, because even though the Galapagos are in South America, the water around the Galapagos is very cool. They'll eat algae at the bottom of off of the rocks until they get too cold. And then when they get too cold, they will come out and sun themselves, because of South America. They warm back up pretty quickly, and then they'll dive back down. And that's pretty much the entire life of the Galapagos marine iguanas. This is a Galapagos giant tortoise. Giant tortoise as in like about so big and about so tall. They're actually quite large animals. That's why it's called a giant tortoise. They're very, very big. The Galapagos as islands have been known by sailors for quite some time. The Galapagos tortoises, many of the species of them have gone extinct. Each different island had its own species of tortoise. It's actually quite a sad story of how most of these tortoises went extinct. Sailors have a hard time getting fresh meat. When you're out on the ocean, everything that you bring with you has to be preserved. And you get sick of eating preserved food after a while. After a while, you'd like to have some fresh. Well, what often would happen is the boats would swing by the Galapagos, and then they would go, and because these tortoises had never seen people before, weren't scared. And so the sailors could basically just go up and grab them, and they would get several of them, a few dozen or maybe a few hundred of them, and would throw them in the base in the bottom of the ship. And then when they wanted some fresh meat, they would just go down and kill a tortoise, because tortoises can go a very long time without being fed. Go down, kill a tortoise, and then you have turtle soup. Many species of them went extinct because of this practice. Very sad. When we talked a little while ago about how the animals of the Galapagos, animals of the Galapagos resemble those on the Ecuadorian mainland, this is referred to as biogeography. What biogeography says is that the organisms in an area tend to be more closely related to each other than they do to organisms farther away. Example, if you were to meet someone in the grocery store, in your hometown, what are the chances that you would run into someone that you were related to? Well, if you were born in that town, and your parents were born in that town, and your grandparents were born in that town, there's a very good chance, a very good possibility that a random person that you ran into in the grocery store would be your relative. But what if you picked up and moved, say, to Los Angeles? None of your family is from California. You're the only one that's there. What are the chances now of you running into a family member when you went to the grocery store? And the chances are very, very low. The organisms in an area tend to be more closely related to each other than they do to organisms much farther away. This is referred to as biogeography. So it stands to reason that this brand new piece of land called the Galapagos, these islands, if they had no living things on them, where is the most likely place for living things to come from to get to the island? And that is going to be the nearest major source of land, and that nearest major landmass, as we already said before, is South America. Why do the organisms in the Galapagos more closely resemble the organisms on Ecuador? It's the closest source of land, biogeography. Darwin, he found that, or he thought, that as the descendants of a remote ancestor spread into various habitats over millions of years, they accumulated diverse adaptations that allowed them to succeed. It makes sense. If you live in an environment and that environment is warm, the only way for you to survive in that environment is if you can withstand warm temperatures. So if mom can withstand warm temperatures and dad can withstand warm temperatures, it stands to reason that the child will withstand warm temperatures, that only the organisms that fit the environment best will live in an environment. And not only that, the ones that fit it better will have more kids. And those that have more kids will pass those better genes down to their children. As organisms live in an area, Darwin believed that the organisms that lived in that area would accumulate diverse adaptations that allowed them to survive or to do better in that environment. Those adaptations could therefore be passed on to the next generation, could therefore be passed on to their kids. We've talked a lot about evolution. You've heard a lot about evolution. Is there evidence for evolution? Yeah, there's actually a lot of evidence for evolution. Science is evidence-based. We don't just make guesses and then say that must be it. That must be the cause. We make a guess, and then, as we already did in lab, as we already discussed, we made a guess, but then we tested our guess to try to find out if it is accurate, if it were true. Some of the evidence for evolution comes from fossils. Fossils are imprints or remains of organisms that lived in the remote past. When we look at these fossils, and when we look at what's called the fossil record, we see animals that don't exist today. We see animals that are here today aren't represented then. But it's not as though they're totally different in many cases. It's that they seem to be earlier versions. They seem to be prototypes. They seem to be similar, but not identical to what we see today. What they then do, or what scientists then do, is they try to document the differences between organisms that existed in the past and follow the chain of fossils up to organisms that exist today. When we look at those organisms from the remote past, we find that, again, very few of them do we see represented today. Well, where did they go? Where did the animals of today come from? Where did the plants of today come from? They had to have come from ancestors from that remote past. That as the environment changed, and this is the key, this is the thing to remember, this is the thing to keep in mind, and that is that the environment does not stay static. The environment changes. What have they been talking about all for the last 5 years, for the last 10 years? Climate change, global warming. All of these things point to an environment that is not 100% stable. And I don't mean like unstable and crazy swings, but at least it changes. It doesn't stay the same. And if you're going to have babies tomorrow, you've got to survive today. And only the organisms that can live today will have babies tomorrow. If you follow that idea of the environment changing over a long period of time, and you tie that to the organisms that live in that environment, that means that the organisms must change with the environment. As the environment changes, as it becomes hotter, as it becomes colder, as it becomes drier, as it becomes wetter, the organisms that live in those environments have to change with it. If you don't, you die. You either change or you die. And the only ones that do live are the ones that can live in that environment. Those are the only ones that are able to have babies tomorrow. This is a fossil skull of Homo erectus. Homo erectus lived about 1.5 million years ago. Does that look like a human skull? Yeah. Does it look exactly like a human skull? No. The face seems really long. The skull seems to be really elongated. That brow ridge is really large. Does it look like it's related to a human? And the answer is yes, it does look related to a human. Is it a modern human skull? No, it is not a modern human skull. We don't see modern human skulls 1.5 million years ago. What do we see? We see relatives of modern humans.